listener production.
Hi, I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Welcome to The Briefing. Women in Korea are swearing off men. It's in response to extreme beauty standards, widespread misogyny, high rates of intimate partner violence and abuse at the hands of men. And it's called the 4B movement.
Initially, their view was to just not get married and not give birth, because it's burdensome. But some started to add dating and sex because that's where things begin.
We dive deeper into South Korea's radical feminist movement in the second half of this episode. First, though, here are today's headlines with Katrina Blowers. It is Friday, the 12th of April.
Hi, Sasha. Hi, everyone. Well, O.J. Simpson, the former American footballer and suspect in a shocking double murder 30 years ago, has died. The 76-year-old's family says he's been battling cancer and passed away surrounded by his children and grandchildren. They've asked for privacy. In speaking about his death, we can't ignore what made him a household name worldwide in the first place. A shocking 8-month murder trial in 1995 in which he was accused of killing his former wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and her friend, Ronald Goldman, in LA. So this trial was the first major US courtroom saga to play out on TVs across the world. Filming inside chambers was still pretty new at the time. It was highly unusual for this kind of stuff to be played out on mainstream TV. The 8-month saga also sparked a media frenzy. It was the subject of intense dinner table conversations. It also spawned a number of what we'd now call memeable moments. Among them, the moment the prosecution asked him to try on blood-stained gloves to prove he wore them to kill the pair, but they didn't fit properly.
It makes no sense. It doesn't fit. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
This trial came to be known as the biggest legal blunder of the 20th century, Sasha.
Yes, and Simpson was eventually found not guilty and later sold the manuscript of this bizarre book he'd written titled If I Did It, which detailed a hypothetical situation which explained how he would have carried out the murders had he been responsible. Simpson went on to be successfully sued by the families of Simpson and Goldman as well. He was ordered to pay them millions of dollars. And in 2008, 13 years after he was found guilty, he was charged and convicted of kidnapping and armed robbery in Las Vegas and sentenced to 33 years behind bars. And this was after he broke into a hotel room of some sports memorabilia dealers and stole items he claimed belonged to him. He got out in 2021 on good behaviour and lived out the rest of his life in a gated community before his death.
Yeah, no doubt he'll remain one of the most divisive and talked about people of our time. You were only relatively young, Sasha, when all of this broke, but it's become such a part of popular culture, and I suppose even after this kidnapping and armed robbery in Las Vegas, these sports memorabilia dealers said that he had confessed to them that he'd done it. So, I guess the secrets will go to the grave with O.J. Simpson.
In 2008, which was 13 years after he was found not guilty, he was charged and convicted of kidnapping and armed robbery in Las Vegas and sentenced to 33 years behind bars. And this was after he broke into a hotel room of some sports memorabilia dealers and stole items he claimed belonged to him. He got out in 2021 on good behaviour and lived out the rest of his life in a gated community before his death. Chaos at our airports next week has been averted after aviation firefighters reached an agreement with their employer, Air Services Australia. Now, there had been a planned strike for 4 hours from 6 a.m. on Monday that would have disrupted flights at 27 airports across the nation and coincided with the start of school holidays in New South Wales and South Australia. It is after the United Firefighters Union Australia said it had found leaked documents from Air Services Australia showing an extreme risk at 13 airports and a high risk at 14 others. The union had been arguing that staff numbers are well below what they need to be and have been putting passengers at risk, Katrina.
Yeah, so we're not quite sure how these two parties came together in the end because they were a really long way apart. The union was seeking a 20% pay increase over 3 years. Air Services Australia had offered 11.2%. We don't have any details of the agreement, but we know that they have reached an in-principle handshake deal. The union now says they're satisfied their key concerns have been addressed, which also included issues around resourcing and working conditions. So that's good news for anyone in New South Wales and South Australia that had school holiday travel booked. A Vietnamese property tycoon has been sentenced to death in the country's biggest ever fraud case. 67-year-old Trong My Lan, chair of real estate company Van Tin Phat, was charged with fraud amounting to $19.1 billion. That's in Australian money. When she was arrested in 2022, that figure represented 3% of Vietnam's GDP. Investigators said she used thousands of ghost companies, paid bribes to government officials and violated banking regulations. Van's lawyers haven't yet commented, but a family member has told Reuters that she will appeal the sentence.
And 3 men who were stranded for a week on a remote atoll in Micronesia have been found alive after they used palm fronds to spell out the word help. Now, their signal for an SOS was luckily spotted by the US Coast Guard, who were doing a flyover. The local men set off on March 31st on a fishing trip, but their vessel was damaged by swells and the alarm was raised on April 6 when they hadn't returned home. They managed to survive on coconuts and luckily they did have water thanks to this small well on the atoll before a reconnaissance jet spotted their help sign on April 7. The US Coast Guard Search and Rescue Mission Coordinator says the palm fronds proved crucial in finding them quickly in this search that spanned 266,000 square kilometres. And to give you an idea of how big that size is, Katrina, it's about the size of New Zealand, so not insignificant.
Not at all. And given, I've seen pictures of this island, it is literally a dot in the ocean. It is so tiny. So, absolutely amazing. True needle in a haystack stuff. Those men were very lucky.
Yep, indeed. Hey, thank you for being here for the headlines. Have a fabulous weekend. Next up, we get into our deep dive on the 4B movement in Korea and why women there are swearing off men. Imagine this. You're a woman living in a version of Australia that has really tightly held beliefs on gender roles. In this Australia, men should work and provide for their families, all while being effectively worshipped and pampered by their wives. The women are expected to look beautiful, wear makeup, dress well, cook, clean and serve their husbands and eventual children. This same society has intimate partner violence at a rate of 41.5%, well over the global average of 30%. Cases of femicide and revenge porn are widespread. Women who dare to go to university are rebuked for trying to take men's places. Men gather in chat rooms to spread misogyny and pepper forums with vulgar posts about women. Imagine being a woman in this country where the government, in response to the declining birth rate, posted an interactive map showing where females of childbearing age were living. And in 2022, the newly elected president blamed feminism for that declining birth rate. I've asked you to imagine this because it is currently happening right now in the developed world, not in Australia, but South Korea. It has sparked a movement called 4B, and we're talking about it today on The Briefing. Joining me now is Su-Kyoung Hwang, a senior lecturer in Korean studies at the University of Sydney. Su-Kyoung, thanks for being here. Tell me exactly what the 4B movement is.
So 4B movement is a radical feminist movement, especially among young women in their 20s. So this movement started around 2018 in online forums. So these women are often anonymously active in online forums, and they made a suggestion that they're going to break out of the shackles of womanhood in Korea, the traditional womanhood. And you can see this movement coming from a digital native generation. So they are, born into the internet world, unlike the women in their 40s. And the number really is your guess. You might get several thousand to tens and thousands, some say 50,000 plus, because a lot of them are anonymous. We don't know how many of them are reading it and how many of them are practicing it in their lives. So some of these women do get together in protests, physical protests in the squares and various places, universities. If you look at the definition of 4Bs, B is a Sino-Korean word or Chinese Korean word referring to no or non. So there are 4 no's basically. One is 비연애, which means no dating, and 비섹스, no sex, and 비출산, which means no childbirth or child rearing, and also 비혼, which means no marriage. So these women are refusing to do all the 4 things that are basically expected from traditional Korean women. Initially, their view was to just not get married and not give birth, because it's burdensome. But some started to add dating and sex because that's where things begin. You don't purposefully plan to get married, but you end up being married because you fell in love. By this way, women are trying to be in charge of their lives, in control of their lives, and try to challenge existing patriarchy or emerging patriarchy.
I'd like to talk about the experience for women living in Korea compared to the experience for women living in Australia. Can you break down some of the things that are going on in South Korea so that we can kind of put it on the spectrum of, for me personally, my experience living in Australia as a woman? What are the differences we're seeing?
There are some distinct differences, and one is, I think, traditional issues of Korea having been Confucian society for more than 500 years. It's really deeply ingrained into the society and culture, although a vast majority of them no longer practice Confucianism. They're identified as Christians, but it's sedimented into society, especially in human relationship, and the emphasis on women's role, the proper women's role, be a good mother, be a good wife, just be nice to people, and be a good carer. So expectation that women, whether they're in their midlife or in their youth, are under that pressure to be that, and at the same time be a competent worker in the capitalistic society. So you have to be, good university student, you go to top universities, and then get a very good job and get promotions and show that you're worthy. Carrying these 2 things, fulfilling both things, are such a great burden to young women, and it's not worthwhile because what is the payoff? What is the reward they're getting? They're asking those questions. So I think the tradition aspect is the difference, and also the fact that Korean society is quite different in terms of historical aspects, like Australia and some of the wealthy countries have progressively become industrialized or developed, whereas Korea experienced that within 30 years, and then they again liberalized in the 1990s. So that kind of cutthroat competition really weighs down on them through history and also through the cultural differences.
What about some of the more extreme experiences of women in Korea? And I say extreme, but the stats kind of paint a different picture, a rate of 41.5% of intimate partner violence, which is much higher than the 30% that is the global average. Message boards with men spreading misogyny and doxing women and sharing images that women haven't consented to. Things like that where it is outright forms of abuse. Is that also informing the 4B movement?
Yes, it is. There's a great sense of insecurity and fear that women experience even in the recent days. I think one thing that alerted them was a 2016 event where 20-something women went to a public bathroom, and then a total stranger that she doesn't know, and he also doesn't know her, followed her and stabbed her multiple times. So she was brutally murdered. Young women looking at that event, so this is not just entirely new. It's something they feared. It could be them. It could be anybody. So they started to rally for the victim for commemoration and pay close attention to the legal proceedings. But another issue is that you get internet kind of misogyny you're not really getting it from face-to-face experience. People are polite. It's a very polite society. But in the internet, in anonymous forums, like right-wing forums like 일간베스트 or 일베, this is what you might call fascist forum, you have guys sharing explicit images or saying demeaning things about women or public figures who are female. So those things, I think it was often talked about, and women started to make counter movement. It's, I think, called Megalia and all other anonymous forums where they belittled men and also like with some symbols like this to make fun of men. And you do see gender wars in the online, especially social media.
The experience of maybe a lot of Australians, or the exposure, I suppose, to South Korea would be through things like K-pop and K-dramas, where an ideal of a man is presented. How close is that to reality?
I think I can make a comparison to, say, Bridget Jones' Diary and Mr. Darcy. He's not really representative of British masculinity, not the average British man. It's more like a train spotting.
Yeah, I suppose you're right. The reality is pretty far from that. Look, Korea already has the lowest birth rate in the world. It's a 0.78 rate of births. That was a figure that surprised me when I read it. Is the 4B movement, which includes no sex and no childbirth or child rearing, is that having an impact on the birth rate, or were we seeing this well before the 4B movement?
4B movement is just 5 years old. It's less than 10 years old. So quite a lot of people are not even aware of it. You might say it has some impact, but it's too recent to judge. What I like to focus on is also the fact that the refusal to have family or get married and have children exists in men too. The younger man of the generation, the whole generation is called give up and things generation, M4 세대, because it's, expensive to raise children in Korea. Korea is a very competitive society. The economy is not doing as great. It's low growth society similar to Japan. So younger generation men and women have been feeling the pressure to live up to the older generation, but they're going to be poorer than them. And I think you can see something similar happening in Australia. So I think they both prefer not to do this. And you don't only see it in Korea, but you also see it in Japan and to an extent China. So it's more of a contemporary culture, but I think Korea stands out because of the extremely low birth rate and the sense of extinction of the nation or the country due to the low birth rate.
So what's the government doing then, not only, I suppose, in response to, not in response to the 4B movement, but I suppose in response to this growing sense among young people that it's kind of, what's the point in reproducing? Also, in terms of things like domestic violence in Korea, is the government having a response to any of this?
Oh, they're trying to actively respond to it. But I think it doesn't make younger women happy. It doesn't really uproot or touch the essential problem, the core of the problem. So some of the proposals that government laid out in the past was to make it easier for women to, in workplace, to request breaks after childbirth, maybe 1 year, maybe half a year. And they also try to give money to families having more than 2 children. But a lot of women feel that this is not simply about childbirth or marriage because they think that the government still sees women as something like baby making machines. Like they're worried about the children not being born rather than how women feel about the quality of their lives.
Do you see longevity in the 4B movement? Is it going to go from strength to strength? Is it going to get bigger? Any sense of that?
I'm not in my 20s, so it's hard for me to really predict that. I did talk to my student yesterday, and she is New Zealander who studied in Korea for 2 years and went to Korean universities. And she said this is very pervasive, and people are going to hold back or keep the 4B movement for some time or indefinitely because 4B movement, although it is a feminist movement, a radical feminist movement, you do see some kind of equivalent among younger men too. They don't see marriage as necessity. They don't see childbearing as necessity. And sometimes they forgo sex or dating. Some people find that cumbersome or too burdensome because it leads to the remaining two. I think one-person family is becoming a dominant family structure in South Korea right now. So based on that trend, it may take years or decades for the 4B movement to phase out, because this is at one point radical but also silent, anonymous movement. You don't have to state it. You just leave that way.
It's a fascinating discussion, Su-Kyoung. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing that insight.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That is all for this morning. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this app with someone you think might enjoy it. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. That's LISTNR. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. See you next time.
Listener.